It's the same place where you went to register for today's webinar at earthquakecountry.org/Northridge30-webinar4. I'd now like to introduce Craig Davis, who is really the champion of this webinar series and coordinating many of our individual episodes and the speakers for them. Craig is retired from Los Angeles Department of Water and Power and remains a very engaged professional in lifeline engineering and other areas. And Craig, go ahead and hold on a second, take over. Craig, make sure you're unmuted. Craig, come off mute, please.
Thank you, Mark. Sorry for that. So thank you, Mark, for the introduction. And I just want to start by pointing out that this is a webinar series titled The Northridge Earthquake, 30 years of something's in my way, sorry, 30 years later, a catalyst for engineering resilient communities. It started on January 17th, 2024 with an in-person meeting, and we are following it throughout the year with this webinar series, which is organized by a group of different associations. Next slide, Mark. Including the American Society of Civil Engineers Infrastructure Resilience Division, the American Society of Civil Engineers Los Angeles Section, the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute Southern California branch, the Southern California Earthquake Association, or the SEOASC, I'm sorry, and Earthquake Country Alliance. And this is the fourth in our series, which I'll introduce in a moment, but I want to point out that we have recorded in all the prior three series, starting in February through the third series was given in June last month. You can see the titles here. I'll save time on that to give to the speakers, but you can find links to all of these presentations or these webinars on the Earthquake Country Alliance website. These are the links and you can Google them as well. Next slide. So this is now the fourth episode in our webinar series. We will continue with hopefully webinars throughout the months, the coming months into January 2024. This episode 4 is titled An Unexpected Milestone in Real-Time Loss Estimation and will be given by Ron Iguchi and David Wald. Ron is the co-founder of ImageCat and a founding chair of the National Institute of Building Sciences Lifeline Advisory Panel. Among many other awards, he was recently the recipient of the ASCE Laval Lund Practice Award for Lifeline System Risk Reduction. Ron is proud of his and his team's role in promoting the use of technologies in an extremely pivotal event following the Northridge earthquake. Dave is a seismologist with USGS in Golden, Colorado, where he leads the development and operations of real-time information systems that you will hear about during his presentation. As a postdoc in the USGS in 1994, he performed aftershock instrumentation deployment at First Light with Sue Huff. You can see their greater bios on the registration site, so please look for those. And I welcome Ron to start, and Ron will hand it over to Dave as he finishes his presentation, and then we will move into the question and answers. So Ron, take the show.
All righty, so let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. All right, let's see, I'm having a little bit of a problem here. Okay, hold on. Okay, are you all able to see my screen?
Yes.
All right, great. Okay, let me get this thing. I'll put you guys off on the side here. All righty. So thank you, Craig, and thank you for inviting both Dave and I to participate in this important webinar series. And I'll just remind Craig that the way we got to this point was he was sharing with me what he was doing with his webinar series for Northridge and all the important things, science and engineering, insurance issues, seismic hazards, and so forth. And I said, Craig, you're missing a very, very important, very interesting story. And that is how technology and how loss estimation really changed, I think, the way that we look at earthquake response and recovery. And so I wanted to encourage him. I said, you should consider adding another webinar which focuses on this. If we think back about the last big earthquake, it was in 1971, and of course, the emphasis, was on changing seismic design of vulnerable buildings and lifelines. And in my opinion, I think very little attention was placed on information technology and the role that they could play in enhancing resilience. So when the Northridge earthquake came along, a lot of us really saw the opportunity to test and utilize information technologies such as real-time earthquake monitoring, GIS, loss estimation, and to use this in an operational sense. Anyway, so Dave and I are going to hopefully bring some interesting and important insights before you. Sorry for the motorcycle. Anyways, I'll cover the Northridge response, and then Dave will discuss how technologies have helped him in the development of some really fabulous tools that USGS is currently providing. Okay, so what were some of the unexpected milestones? From my opinion, my point of view, I think there were three very important ones. The first one is that real-time earthquake monitoring, I thought, was beginning to emerge as a very important and possible technology that we could deploy during earthquake response. This is something that had been deployed in Japan, for a number of years, and it was sort of lagging, I think, development here in the U.S. But Caltech and USGS pushed forward an effort to upgrade the Southern California seismic network by producing a product, a tool called Cube, which was Caltech USGS broadcast of earthquakes, which I'll introduce, and Dave will follow up on with a lot more detail. Second area is loss estimation modeling, and loss estimation modeling, was around for a while, but it was primarily scenario-based. It resulted in paper maps and tables, and really didn't utilize the sort of information technologies that were beginning to emerge, like GIS, that would allow a user to rapidly calculate impacts. And so this is something that I thought was a very important development that was accelerated by the earthquake. And then finally, GIS, again, this is a technology that was around for a while, but was not being broadly used in say, disaster response and recovery. And I think this really gave us and the Northridge earthquake an opportunity to really showcase this technology. So Cube, I thought, was one of the really exciting early developments prior to the Northridge earthquake. I remember talking to Tom Heaton about his vision on how this technology, could be deployed. And I started thinking, okay, well, if we're able to sort of combine and integrate what we do in loss estimation with something like what he was envisioning, that we would have a pretty powerful response tool. So the theory was that within minutes, the size, the location of the earthquake could be produced and made available via pagers. I don't know if you remember pagers, but that was a pretty exciting technology at the time. And loss modelers like myself and others were getting pretty excited because we felt like if we had size, location, and could place that on a fault, that we could calculate ground motions using standard attenuation models and overlay that information onto GIS databases that would contain information on building exposure and populations, and then therefore estimate earthquake losses. Unfortunately, Cube wasn't fully operational at the time, but I think that the concept was so important that I wanted to mention it here. And of course, it's really sort of the foundation for a lot of things that Dave will talk about in a few minutes. So prior to the earthquake, EQE, the company that I was working for at the time, was working with the state, the Office of Emergency Services, OES, to develop a loss estimation model that could be used for planning purposes. And what they wanted was they wanted something a little bit more flexible that would allow them to look at different scenarios, look at losses in a much more rapid fashion. And so we had started that effort, but at the time of the Northridge earthquake, only the models and some data were available for us to do something. But fortunately, my close colleague and friend Charlie Scawthorne had been working on a model as well called EQE Hazard, and we used his model to produce a preliminary ground motion map that is MMI for the earthquake. It was primarily pixel based, focused on MMI. It did address things like soil conditions, and it was very, very useful in defining the scope of the earthquake. Some of the things that we did, and I want to mention that map was produced 10 hours after the earthquake occurred. We also looked at some human impacts, and 4 days after the event, we produced estimates of number of deaths. We estimated 40 to 430. The actual number turned out to be 57. Number of injuries, we estimated to be 1,590 to 54,000. The actual number was a little under 12,000. And the number of displaced persons or individuals, we estimated being between 6,000 and 19,000. The actual number is 24,000. I think this information was very helpful in trying to not only scope the disaster, but also to help guide some very, very important response activities. So how was all this information used? I think there are a lot of things that were not possible before the earthquake that we were able to use the technology and the loss results to help make decisions on. For example, some of the questions that we're being asked was, how big was this event? Did we have enough manpower for search and rescue? Do we have enough medical capacity to treat all the injured? How many shelters do we need to set up? And what level of outside help was going to be needed in order to effectively respond? So these are some of the questions that the state and others were trying to deal with, and by having information on at least the heavily damaged or the high shaking areas, we were able to help at least provide some sort of guidance in addressing some of these questions. We also found that the information and the maps and things that were produced were very useful in briefing state agency executives, especially the governor and the director of OES. And as I mentioned, this information, even preliminary and very, very coarse, was very useful in helping to make decisions regarding shelter needs, where they should be located, as well as fast tracking a very important disaster housing assistance program. I think one of the most important uses, though, was helping to establish that initial estimate of dollar loss caused by the earthquake. When we first started doing the analysis, we came up with estimates of dollar loss of between $15 to $17 billion, and this was generated within several days of the earthquake. And it turns out that this was very important information to help in the process of trying to establish funding requirements from the federal government. In subsequent days, that estimate was revised upward, at least the upper portion. And this is based on looking at field reports and surveys. And then finally, 3 years afterwards, Jim Goetz and I and others produced a more comprehensive assessment of what the direct losses were. And we estimated in that paper that the losses were in excess of $40 billion. So this is all very, very important information, I thought, in not only helping in the initial response, but also in helping to direct some of the recovery efforts. So some of the things that I think EPIDAT, the tool that was used to make these early loss estimates, some of the things that it did to pave the way, I think, for some other subsequent very important developments were things like, for example, essentially substantiating the value of a network-based system where you can produce very, very rapid estimates of not only earthquake occurrence, location, and so forth, but eventually ground motions, which is something that Dave will talk about. And arguably, I think that having EPIDAT and its application and demonstration that was very useful in that event, I think spurred the federal government to invest in a nationally standardized loss estimation methodology, which turns out to be ASCE, which is virtually used by all government agencies. It was also very useful in helping to look at mitigation measures on a regional perspective. And then finally, I think it really provided at least some hope that perhaps loss estimation methods could be used to help sort of guide and inform recovery and rebuilding strategies, which is something I think Lori Johnson will talk about in the next webinar. Okay, and all this, of course, wouldn't have been possible with with a very strong team, and I think the three top people in this list here, I think were extremely instrumental in making all this happen. Okay, so I want to segue with my remaining time to talk about GIS. GIS before the earthquake, I think, was very limited in its use. And so I think the Northridge earthquake really offered a real opportunity to showcase the value of GIS, particularly for monitoring and tracking the response and recovery of a real disaster. And so when the earthquake occurred, Paul Flores, who was the deputy director of OASC at the time, asked me and Jim Goetz to meet with the GIS manager in the disaster field office to talk about, his ideas and what he wanted to do. And when we both walked into this huge room, there was Dave Caroline, who was the manager, and a huge empty room. And he started talking about what he wanted to do, his big plans, his vision, and so forth. And Jim and I looked at each other and we said, there's nothing here. There's nobody here, and there's no tools, no computers, and so forth. And what was interesting was that when we came back several days later, the room was filled with people, boxes of software, GIS database software stacked to the ceiling, and he had a lot of people working for him on this disaster. And then in the weeks and months after the earthquake, his group, supported by EQA, I thought did some very monumental work using GIS technologies and really helping to produce a lot of important data and information, which is reflected in the two reports that you see on the screen. And again, there are a lot of people that were very important to this, in this development, and I want to certainly recognize their contributions. Okay, so some of the early things that were very useful that were produced not only for the state, but others were, the very first thing I think was the modified Mercalli intensity map. And this was based on taking information from accelegraphs, but also, more importantly, observations that were being reported throughout the affected or impacted region. You can see some of the dots. and the numbers that were being used. And this is sort of a precursor to what Dave Wald has developed and has deployed, which is the Did You Feel It methodology and product. Another thing that we focused on was we felt that there was an important, not only opportunity, but an important need for us to collect and document information on where the building damage or what damage had occurred, where it was occurring, and so forth. And so we spent a lot of time creating databases, working with the county assessor's office to categorize where buildings were located within the different modified McCallie zones. We tried to incorporate information on year built, the type of use, and also size. We thought all this information, was going to eventually be very important in trying to document this event from the standpoint of damage functions.
About 4 minutes, Ron.
Okay, thank you. All right, and so we also wanted to make sure that we produce not only pretty maps, but informative maps. And here you see a map of basically safety assessments, red, yellow, green tag buildings. That was the information was produced by the Building and Safety Department for Los Angeles. And this information was very important in briefing government officials in not only basically with the extent of damage caused by the earthquake, but also the inspection process and how it was proceeding, because these maps were produced on a regular basis and for decision makers. This information was essentially provided to the different affected cities. We tried to do this based on occupancy types. We also began to take the damage information. What I described earlier was exposure information, that is total inventories. But we wanted to take the damage information, the different buildings, and place them into the categories that we had set up for the exposure database, and that is year built, general use, size, but do it also in the different MMI zones. And then we also tried to take a further look at damage ratios or damage ranges and place that information. And this information was very, very useful in creating preliminary damage curves, which you see here on the left. Well, you can't see too much because it's so small, but it's basically showing you how the percent damage varied by, in this case here, peak ground acceleration, by size of building, by vintage, and this information, I think, really was very important in trying to calibrate and validate some of the models that were used initially in making those loss estimates. And you can see the map on the right there, which shows essentially peak ground acceleration contours and then how it overlaid onto development patterns. And then finally, there was a lot of information that was very important from the standpoint of essentially implementing grants and so forth, especially the individual assistance grants. And so displaying this information, okay, in a very easily understood way by census tract in this case here was a very important objective for the GIS group. And here you see another way of displaying the same information by showing the concentration of these applications and the actual awards. So, and ultimately this was very important in helping us actually document and track essentially the costs over time. And this was done for over, basically for several years after the earthquake. And then finally, this last slide here shows you what I think were some of the important applications of GIS and summarized in these two reports here. And if you want to download a copy of these two very large reports, I've got links right here, and I'll also put the links in the chat session so that you can actually copy and download this information. So at this point, I'd like to turn over the presentation over to my colleague Dave Walt, who will talk about what USGS has been able to do over the decades after Northridge and produce very, very useful products. So I think, let's see if I end my slideshow. Okay, stop sharing.
Thanks, Ron. Ron, thank you so much, and thanks, Craig and Mark, for organizing this, and welcome Vanessa to SCEC. I'm going to share my screen now. See if I can get this to work, and go into presentation mode. How's it look? You see my slides?
Perfect.
Okay. Well, thanks again, Ron. Ron and I were involved with this early on, 30 years ago, and we're still at it. So I'm going to change gears quite a bit. I'm coming to you from the National Earthquake Information Center in Golden, Colorado, where we continue to develop some of these products in collaboration with lots of academics and also our colleagues in USGS in California. And what I'll do is bring you to what we had at the time and show you what we can do now, and maybe give you a hint to where we're going with all this. As Craig mentioned, I was a postdoc at the USGS, just having finished my PhD at Caltech across the street in 1994. And early that morning, right after the earthquake, Sue Huff and I went out with some seismometers to Northridge and put out what we call the aftershock deployment. I'll show you what we did with that and what the purpose of that is. But what I'll cover is basically on left here in black and white, what we could do within 30 minutes is to put an epicenter and a magnitude on the map. And that was useful, of course, but not what we can do today. And in fact, we struggled to do that given the technology at the time. And now we can not only make a map of shaking rapidly within a few minutes of an earthquake, but we can estimate the losses, as we'll talk about, not only in California, but globally. And I think that's a huge advancement. So I'll give you a hint of where we were at the time of the earthquake and where we're going. And I'll give you kind of a Wizard of Oz approach, where the times of the Northridge will be black and white, and then we'll switch to color as we go to the modern era. So in black and white, at the time of the Northridge earthquake, this is a typical summary of the earthquake catalog that my wife Lisa was part of publishing. And this is just the seismicity. The dots represent small earthquakes and the faults along the Southern California. And our seismic network at the time was this small triangles here showing what we called short period vertical ground motion recorders, seismometers, that allowed us to map out the seismicity, but they would go off scale for any large earthquake. So they were very valuable in mapping out locations of earthquakes, but in doing so in relatively real time, but would go off scale. So we developed a Terrascope network. This is 12 stations at the time. These were very broadband, very scientifically very valuable stations, the first of its kind, along with strong motion stations that would come in real time. And this really was a game changer. This Terrascope work combined efforts by Caltech and the USGS in Pasadena to expand the network into a modern seismic network. So Terrascope was the original 12 stations of that broadband networks, and built into what we call TriNet, which was to add CGS, which was at the time CDMG, who had many, many strong motion instruments, but they were all analog recorders, and they were not providing real-time information. So at the time of the Northridge earthquake, we had lots of good recordings of the ground motion, of the acceleration of the ground on the right, and the velocity of the ground below that. These recordings, however, I had to digitize by hand. Ultimately, they were professionally digitized, but this took months to get these data in a useful form, which is something we can do now in seconds. Those data were very valuable, of course, because we could map out not only the slip on the fault, but the fault itself. And these on the lower left here, this fault plane, we were able to determine because we had seismometers not only around Southern California, but the ones that Sue Huff and I put out above the earthquake source allowed us to get much better depths and determine the exact location of this fault plane, going from about 5 kilometers down to 20 kilometers, a plane, by the way, that we did not know existed effectively before the earthquake. And then we can map out the slip distribution and even the timing of the slip distribution, which is something that these really important strong motion instruments allow us to do, But at the time, it took a year, as you can see from this publication, to actually learn all those things from the available data. The other thing at the time we were able to do was then take the peak values of each of these stations and contour those. And these on the right are the contours of the peak velocity of the ground, which corresponds very well with the damage to steel structures and other structures. And again, at the time, this took a year to make this kind of map. And that's something that we, at the time, decided we needed to do a lot quicker, and we could start to do with the flow of information, seismic data that was coming in real time. But a few more ingredients were needed to do that. And we started about 1999. We got serious about some additional products. The shake map concept was one of them. We published that in 1999, and that was to combine ground motion recordings, the peak amplitudes, with intensities that were reported on the same map. And the intensities that were reported were allowed by having, again, the internet availability and the ability to have people come in and go to web pages and fill out questionnaires. And the DigiFeel system came along to complement the shake map in terms of providing data where there were insufficient seismic stations. One of the things that was required was the relationship between what we call peak ground motion and intensity, which allowed us to combine these on one map, as I'll show you. So at the time, 1999, the first shake maps we were producing were published. And again, these contours now represent what could be done by combining ground motion data with the intensity data that's available. And we could now do this in real time as long as the data were flowing to the data center. Kind of fun thing is, if you recall back in the day, we couldn't attach 2 megabyte files to an email. We couldn't attach anything to an email. So we had to figure out how to represent the shake map in ASCII form, very low bandwidth. And if you recognize on the left the outline of Southern California, this was how we made shake maps and sent them out via email with fixed width characters with the intensity value and the epicenter shown as a star and the asterisks, and then the intensity value shown, of course, with the number in the area. So the area that's outside the shake map is the slashes, and the shake map area is the numbers. Now with the modern color scheme, we represent this in a little bit more flair, but this was a pretty useful map, and all these little characters represent cities that you probably recognize initials for. Again, the addition of DigiFeel, it was extremely important at the time. These now are 13,000 entries. Now, this wasn't running in Northridge. This is something we started in 1999, but people have come in since then and said, well, yeah, I remember what happened in Northridge. And we've got 13,000 entries, which we average over these 1 kilometer cells. And these are the intensities reported for this particular earthquake. So with the shake map approach, we can take, on the left here is intensity, on the right is acceleration. We can just map out the ground motions and infer the shaking in other places with just the triangles, the seismic stations. And that rectangle represents the area of fault that slipped, and we can make a pretty good estimate of either the intensity or the shaking acceleration, as we show with topography on the right. But we can also relate the intensities that are reported through this instrumental intensity scale that we developed that allows us to take what's recorded in the ground and estimate the intensities, or take what's in the what's reported in terms of intensities and estimate the acceleration or the velocity of the ground. So with that combination, we can then add the felt reports, these little circles here, to make a more comprehensive map in the combination of the two. Now, in Southern California, we have enough stations that we get a pretty darn good map, as I showed you, with just the stations. But in other places, particularly in the East Coast, the US, and other places around the world, these felt reports become very important because we don't have enough seismic stations. Okay, so we moved on. Now we're back into the color world, and we've developed a whole suite of products that you're probably aware of that render information not only in the pre-earthquake planning mode, scenarios, and probabilistic seismic hazard, but also what we've been talking about in the immediate post-earthquake environment. So this suite of products, of course, is what you expect to see now on our modern event web page. And we highlight the ones that we try to use for not only planning purposes, but response purposes. And that's the DigiFeel system combined with the shake map instrumentation. That goes into the pager system. Of course, the ShakeCast system, which I'll mention very briefly, is kind of key. And a very new tool that we've only had in the last couple of years is an estimate of the ground failure, both in terms of liquefaction and landsliding possibilities. So embarrassingly, we go back and look at some of our old web pages, just the Wayback Machine, looking at 2004. Lisa Wald and I, we helped develop these web pages. Lisa did all the work on this. It's kind of fun to go back in time, but it's a little embarrassing. The ability that we have now, of course, is to use interactive web pages, and I hope you use these. The layers on the right are layers that you can just add and subtract from the interactive web page on our event page, including putting the shaking contours on top of population, adding the stations and the did you feel it circles that are reported, and other kinds of information, like in this case, the landslide probability with respect to the population and with respect to the mountains and the shaking. So a lot more content that we've been able to add with the advancements of the tools that we've developed. Each of these are still work in progress. So for instance, Shake Map now, we have added a few bells and whistles moving forward now. One of them is multi-period Shake Map. We're now able to make Shake Map not just at 3 spectral acceleration periods, but a full range of periods. It's very important for engineering. Some other things that we will very quickly just give you. Shake Map sampling tool allows people to go in and put in a location and get the shaking layer, the shaking values at that particular location. I'll skip the Shake Map composite Shake Map, but ENS now is a very important addition that I'll mention, and how we're using that with the shaking values combined. Of course, Pager now is facilitated and only been possible by having shake maps that run around the world. The Pager system, of course, gives us estimated fatalities and economic losses. For the Northridge earthquake, if we rerun that through the system, we get very reasonable estimates of the fatalities given the shake map that we had and just showed you, and economic losses, and this we can do now globally. The way we can do this is we made shake maps all over the world for historic earthquakes going back to 1900, and all these shake maps have constraints. Part of them are from the felt reports and from the historical intensities, others from seismic stations in different places of the world. And the key here is the technology has allowed us to take those shake maps, look at the population at the time of the earthquake, correct it for the time of the earthquake, and the data sets we've aggregated to get losses for all of these earthquakes allow us to model the fatalities and economic losses for each country individually, and allows us to then do this systematic loss estimation globally. The one addition that we have now domestically is we combine the Pager system by sending the shake map to FEMA, having FEMA run HAZIS, and bring that HAZIS loss estimation into these one-page summaries. And the one-page summary now can have building tagging information in the occupancy and types of structures based on the HAZIS inventory and infrastructure. So that's a really advanced that we can then do spatial losses and do that by county rather than just doing it as an aggregate that we do on the top of the Pager system with the total losses and total economic losses. Just last one or two things. Here's a SheaCast system. Now, this is not publicly shared on our web pages. Each individual group or group that we host gets to see the output of the SheaCast system for their inventory. In this case, this is the Caltrans system, the CT on the top, with the bridges that were shaken in the magnitude 6 earthquake that we show here back in 2022 in northernmost California. And the SheaCast system is simply out there running, taking the shake map and overlaying facilities, critical facilities, and sending notifications to users that need to know how to inspect these and how to prioritize their inspections. And so, though not something that's shared on the web, these results go to many, many different groups. And we just had a conversation this morning with Central Cal Edison, who's planning some scenarios. We'll use the shake map scenarios in the SheaCast system that they're running in order to see what might happen in such an earthquake. So we have a lot of these SheaCast users that, again, don't rely on our web pages, but rely on the SheaCast system to provide them information. Now, the earthquake notification system is something that we put together in 2006, and it basically gives you magnitude and location. But what we've now turned to, and this will be up by the end of the year, fully functional. There's about 600,000 recipients of text messages, but we're going to add the pager alerts to the ENS2, so you can get alerts based on the color coding of the pager alert. Or, this is a big addition here, you could put in a couple locations and get shaking based on the points of interest. If they exceed a particular shaking level, you can get a notification via text message and email. So I'm going to skip out and just close by saying that a lot of the content that I just summarized here, I put together a pretty long article that describes the evolution of these tools. And the nice thing about this collection is that there's a lot of references for all the different contributions and all the different work that went into making these systems. So I'll leave it at that and give you some links and my contact information if you want to follow up, as well as on the right to know that for technical users, there's now ways to sign up through the government email distribution for newsletters and for follow-up information. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you all.
Well, thank you, Dave and Ron. That was excellent. As a person who actually saw a number of those things, Ron, it brought back a lot, and I would say very interesting to actually know how all this transpired, and that somebody I have gotten to know very well, or two people I've gotten to know very well, and how well you were engaged with that. So with that, I'm going to move forward into the Q&A. We have about 15 minutes. And then we'll formally close, but the audience should know that both Ron and Dave have offered to stay on after the top of the hour for those who want to actually spend more time and have more direct communications with them. Maybe mark that. And before I move into any questions, I want to point out that during Ron's presentation, Dr. Charles Scawthorne, who worked very closely with Ron at the time of the Northridge earthquake, had a lot of very good points that he put into the chat. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those, maybe scroll back in the chat and you might find some of that useful and interesting. But please add to the Q&A, and I'm going to go ahead and get started with this. And I'm going to start with Dave with this one question. Dave, what was it about the Northridge earthquake in particular that motivated such efforts to improve operational earthquake information capabilities?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ron. Craig. The interesting thing about that earthquake was early in the morning, so it was dark. You know, getting information immediately at the time was extremely difficult. Getting a magnitude and location, we struggled to do that, and that was our success story, but that's not enough actionable content for people to really know what the distribution of the shaking and the impacts were. So it was a pretty devastating event in terms of the total damage. Luckily, the fatalities were pretty low, but it really was a wake-up call to say that, you know, we have some unknown faults. They're going to produce shaking in patterns that we can't anticipate necessarily. But if we have the right tools in place, we can rapidly describe the shaking and then get out very useful information. I don't think at the time we realized how much we could do in terms of loss estimation, and the work that ImageCat and FEMA and so many other groups have done to try to use our shaking to constrain the losses, I think was all coming out of what happened from the Northridge earthquake.
All right, thank you, Dave. I'm going to move on to some other questions, but before I do, I'm going to ask Dave and Ron and also Mark, at your opportunity before we close up this session, there are two questions related to the KML files and how to do this. I don't want to spend time online talking about it, but maybe you could look at those when you have a moment to respond directly by typing. So
Sure thing.
I'm going to go to Ron. Were there any problems or surprises that affected your ability to produce your loss estimates after the earthquake?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, okay, great. There were a lot of things that we had to sort of improvise or pull together and so forth, and I won't go into a lot of details there, but there was an interesting sort of episode within the event that I thought, I might share. When we were producing this information for the state, one of the things that happened that we developed was it wasn't a spreadsheet, but it was a computer listing of numbers. 8.5, 9.1, 7.0, and so forth. And these were actually modified Mercalli intensities, and they were associated with zip codes. But there was a rumor going around that the government wasn't being truthful about, the actual earthquakes that were occurring. And in fact, there was rumors going around that, there was a magnitude 9.1, there was a magnitude 7.5, and all these earthquakes and so forth. And what was happening was that they were misinterpreting the intensities to be magnitudes. And I thought that, that was kind of interesting. And it just alerted us that, we need to be very careful about the information that we produce. And educate and hopefully educate, the public, as well as important decision makers on what these, what these differences were. And so, anyways, there were a number of things like that I think put a little color in the event and in our response, and that was one thing I thought I might share.
I remember those rumors. It's interesting to hear how that transpired and how you handled it. Dave, question for you. Oh, hold on. I'm not able to scroll to get to that one. Hold on,
I see the one fire following earthquake from Charlie.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Charlie, yes.
Yeah, so Charlie asked about including fire following earthquake. Obviously, that's going to be a game changer in certain circumstances. If fires really break out and you get conflagrations, that's going to be the big story. One of the things about loss modeling is there's certain parts of it that are extremely difficult that I think have diminishing returns in terms of our abilities. But we can, for instance, do losses if we have buildings monitored. Every building monitored in the future is not a far-fetched notion, so that you actually record damage, aggregate that information. I think the same thing is probably true on the fire side. You have to, inferring it with just a model is going to be very difficult, but looking at what's happening in the field and then updating models of winds and damage from the prior models that we have, I think is really going to be the game changer. So I think this combination of model and ground truth is going to be really the future. And it also goes to the question about research potential that Megan asked. I think that's a really fun challenge to think how we're going to improve these things. And my hope is that, we have initial model in the first few minutes, but over time, the information that flows from everything from building monitoring to 911 to social media to imagery from satellites, I think was going to add to the initial story to get more and more accurate products as we go forward in time.
Yeah, I really want to underscore that, Dave, because I really think that, we are getting just a whole bunch of information and data in almost real time that, if you begin to apply sort of the AI and machine learning methods, there's no reason why the models that we use in our loss estimation methodologies can't be updated, to reflect observations, that we're seeing out in the field, maybe instrumentation, like you say, from buildings and so forth. And I think trying to scale and calibrate, these models based on this type of information, I think will be something that will help us begin to reduce some of the uncertainties and provide a more accurate assessment. And there's no reason why it can't be done quickly, given the information that we have in the situation that we currently are able to work within. So
yeah, agreed.
Okay, thank you, guys. For the audience, there's still time for more questions. We'll be here till the top of the hour, and you can stay a little bit longer if you want with Ron and Dave. Ron, I have another question for you. What recommendations do you have now for improving the accuracy of loss estimations after large events?
Well, let's see. I'll rewind here again, and I think that Dave and I covered, I think, some of the areas that we see as possibilities, and so and I'll emphasize the remote sensing aspect as well, because we seem to have these constellation of satellites and airborne units and so forth. So I think the notion of looking at the event from the air, from space, I think is certainly here. And I think trying to find, effective ways of utilizing this information to get a handle, on sort of the broader scheme of the disaster, I think is important. So, I'll just and Dave said this. I'll underscore remote sensing again. This is important technology.
Hey, Craig, Mike Blampied has an interesting question about what the challenges were at the time of the earthquake, in addition to the lack of real-time flow of information. One of the things that's really been challenging is when we do have these maps of the shaking distribution, people have to understand what intensity is. And, Ron alluded to the notion that people confused magnitude and intensity. I think we've gone a long way to revisit intensity as a really good way of describing the pattern of shaking. And at the time of the earthquake, giving out a magnitude 6.7, it's something that's really hard to communicate the meaning of that. The fact that it's in Northridge or in the northern San Fernando Valley, it doesn't tell you enough information. And the evolution, I think, that you've seen with the products that we've shown today, and even the initial EPIDAT model, was that the distribution of shaking is something we have to really communicate to people. People still anchor earthquake information to magnitude and location, and we really need to get back beyond that to communicate what we now know. Other things, Ron, that might have been challenging at the time? You mentioned a GIS lack of even a printer at the time.
Yeah. I think even just communicating among ourselves, I think that can't remember whether I had a cell phone or at least a mobile phone, but trying to communicate and coordinate with your team and so forth, you had to go back and find a phone.
Yeah, we've gone a long ways, huh? So, which kind of brings up some thoughts that maybe I could throw out to both of you. Where do you think the real-time shaking and loss estimates will be in 10 or another 30 years?
Yeah, I can take that. There's also a question about modeling non-ductile concrete buildings. I don't want to make it only the future is ground truthing information. Improving the models is really a really important part of that. A lot of the loss models that we have, we really don't know what the buildings are made of. We've got really good building footprints now, but we don't know what the structure types are. And once we do know the structure types, we still have a limit to what we can do with a peak ground motion to get to actual losses. So we need to move beyond peak metrics to duration and to time series and things like that. So there's a lot to do to improve the prior models. But I do think, especially on a global scale, we have very little knowledge of what buildings are out there, who's in them at the time of the earthquake, what their migration patterns are, and what the types of structures, how they respond given a particular shaking. So I think that's going to be solved. We're looking at I think we know the building footprint of every structure on Earth now, or to some degree. That's going to be done even better. And then we're going to be able to map what types of structures those footprints actually are. And that'll be a game changer. What else, Ron, in terms of 10 years, 20 years from now?
I think that just building on what you said, I think that having footprints, I think, is very important. And even having, some notion of size by looking at heights, I think is key. But one of the problems we have is that we don't always know what kind of building it is. Buildings that you think are steel frame, are actually concrete buildings, and vice versa and so forth. And I think that if we're going to do a better job, more effective job at trying to estimate what these losses are, we have to have a better exposure database. And I think that even though, more information is being collected on buildings and so forth, I still think that, we are not guiding maybe the data collectors and so forth and really getting the right information. And I think that's really one of the areas that could greatly enhance what we do if we get better information on the actual exposure. The other thing too is that I think we've been talking a lot about buildings, but lifelines are very, very, very important. And, we don't have, resilience, of our cities unless, the lifelines are working, power, water, and so forth. And I really think that there needs to be, a lot more focus on lifelines and trying to understand the importance of these lifelines and their interconnections, not only within themselves, but also the buildings, to really understand the resilience of our cities and communities. So I'm hoping that, there's a new initiative out that NIBS, National Institute of Building Sciences, that Craig talked about, that is trying to push forward, this type of initiative for lifelines. And I'm just hoping that, we can get a lot more people and actual resources behind that to push it forward.
Let me just add one thing. Charlie notes that we'll have better fragility curves down the road. I certainly hope so. But the same thing with when you have epidat and you estimate the shaking, you always have uncertainty. When you record the shaking, you reduce that radically. I think with smart sensors, DAS arrays, and other types of sensors and structures, we're going to actually record strain. We're not going to infer strain from seismometers. We're going to record it probably at every building. We're going to have MEM sensors everywhere. So I think the distribution of sensors is going to really change our ability to actually measure losses instead of just estimating them. But as we talked about earlier, the hybrid of combining those two is going to be the holy grail.
Okay, thank you both. I need to interject here. You have lots of great information. What I want to do at this point in time is be respectful for everybody who's online and watching, and we want to give a formal closure to this session. But remember, Ron and Dave have agreed to stay on, and so I'll follow up with that in a moment. So before we give the formal closure, I want to introduce to you episode 5, titled Legacies of the Northridge Earthquake and Disaster Recovery Planning and Policy. This webinar will be given on August 28th from 12 to 1 p.m., same time as now. Lori Johnson, Rob Olshansky. And for those who have seen the announcement on this before, please pay attention to the date. We have moved the date out a little bit. Originally, it was only a couple of weeks from now, but we felt it better to move it out to August 28th. It is not on August 7th, like originally stated. It is the same webinar, though. So please be prepared for that. Now, this is the formal closure, and we thank everybody for attending, but the informal portion will continue. And so please stay on if you want. And if you want to better communicate with Ron and Dave, please raise your hand on the electronically, of course, because we're not going to see it otherwise. And Mark will be able to even allow you to speak directly one at a time to Ron and or Dave, and we can stay here for a little while until maybe the interest has waned or everybody has to move on to lunch or their normal activities. But please feel free to stay for this time and write your questions in the chat or the Q&A portion, or raise your hand.
I do see a question from Selchuk Toprak about the liquefaction and landslide probability maps. I'll be glad to tackle that one.
Please.
Yeah, so the first pass that we've made at taking the shake map and estimating landslide and liquefaction distribution is done on a global scale. So it's extremely coarse. The proxies that we use are, this topographic slope, the shaking input from shake map, wetness, the distance to water bodies, and proxies for the material properties of the soil and rock. And so those are very approximate. And I think all of those can be improved with regionalization and local data that will give us a lot more information about the geotechnical properties at a much finer scale. But collecting that data is on a global scale is prohibitive right now. So I think that's an easy way to improve things. along with those will be these models that machine learning and AI approaches to improving the models in the first place. But as we mentioned earlier, if you have ground truth observations of landslide liquefaction and you have imagery, that's something we're working on right now to enhance our prior models of the landslide and liquefaction probabilities. And it's a hugely challenging problem, and recognize that the satellite availability is not under our control. So it's not going to be the hour after the earthquake. It could be hours and even days before that information is available. Yeah, thanks for the question, Selchuk. Good to see you.
Do we have any others? I lost track of some of the things in the chat. Dave, you seem to have been doing a better job. I was watching the Q&A.
Craig, are we able to, are the the remaining participants, are they able to speak?
They can if they raise their hand, and Mark can allow them to speak.
All right, there was a question on insurance, and I see that hopefully Charlie's still on, because I know that Charlie Scawthorne talked about this in one of your earlier webinars.
So Charlie is on. He just raised his hand. And also,
Yeah.
Mark, there's Ken Hudnett and Lori Johnson have their
Ken
hands
Hudnett
raised
is able
as
to
well.
speak now. Ken, go ahead. You may be muted on your end. It's definitely been, you've been given permission to speak, but we're not hearing you.
Yeah, he's having problems because it was unmuted and now it shows muted.
Let's go ahead and go to Lori Johnson, who's also raised her hand. Hopefully it works now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So going to, thank you both, by the way. This is a great presentation. It's just so amazing to look back in time and see all of that work that was done by both of you and others in that moment of such uncertainty. But I guess, Ron, I wanted to bring up, going back to Mike Blampede's question, as I recall, some of the EPIDET work was also used initially by Cal OES with FEMA to issue fast track issuing individual assistance to certain zip codes. I don't know, did you mention that? But I thought that was a really interesting application to bring up to people, because there was kind of, going to Mike's point, some concern later from I think FEMA about that application.
Yeah, I talked really briefly about it in one of the early slides, but you know, the notion of having to go through sort of the traditional process of, you know, getting applications, sending somebody out to you know, sort of verify that, you know, the damage has, you know, was there, it had occurred, and it was serious and so forth. Would normally take a very long time, but what the state did was that it began to use the information that was being produced, you know, by the GIS group to actually go through a very rapid screening process. And that is, you know, if there was, you know, some application in an area that, you know, had a very high intensity and so forth, that, you know, it fast track that application, as opposed to one that might be in Nevada, for example. Somebody applying for a grant or aid that was certainly outside the area of heavy damage, that would not have the same sort of priority. So I think that, you know, that was something that was tried. It was a very innovative sort of strategy, and I think by and large, I think it really helped the state, you know, respond very quickly to a lot of these important things. So that, that was.
Let me add to that. Lori, the original financial losses in pager, green, yellow, orange, red, 1 million, 100 million, billion. Those were actually set working with Doug Bausch at FEMA to look at effectively what would be a multi region FEMA response and what would be a national response. But the current motion direction going to this 2-pager, which is a combination of pager and HAZIS, going to the county level, I think is really key, because we're aggregating at the county level, which is, for a major national disaster, it's not pretty obvious that the counties are included, but in some cases, we're going to have single counties or just a few counties that are going to be asking for aid. And so that aggregation, I think, is going to be pretty important going forward for those kinds of declarations.
Thank you.
Okay, Ken, we can hear you now.
Oh, good. Sorry for the technical difficulty. Can you hear me? You can hear me? Okay. All right. Well, I was hoping to just add a bit of a bridged comment here to carry from the nice Laval Lund Symposium panels that were held at USC not too long ago, about a month ago. I just wanted to mention that in response to questions, Youssef Bozonia and others on the panel really pretty much uniformly came through with similar recommendations to what I'm hearing here today, I think, and that is more instrumentation is better as a generality, and I think that's sounding like it's pretty well agreed to. And the technology, that emphasis, Ron, that you made, and how you described the arc in new technology adoption from 71 San Fernando to Northridge, and then from Northridge to now, and how that arc is expected to continue and accelerate. I'm also excited by that, but I do also see some limitations, some hurdles up ahead. So I guess probably we all do. But I thought that was so interesting that there was this commonality between groups that were more heavily engineering focused and groups that are more earth science focused, but just that common denominator that there seems to be a very strong common interest in increasing the instrumentation, even if that means, using more MEMS. I saw Charlie Scawthorne's comment in the chat and wanted to resonate with that too. So just seems like there's tremendous potential, and just wanted to kind of, provide that bridge from the previous symposium that you convened, Craig and Ron. Thanks.
I'll also add as well. I think that in addition to the the common vision between engineers and the seismologists and so forth, I think that there is also beginning to develop a stronger connection between the social scientists and the engineers and the geoscientists. Because if we're really going to begin to model or even quantify things like resilience, community resilience, we need to take it beyond just building damage and even lifeline damage. We need to begin to look at impacts on people and so forth. And so I think that the sorts of things that I believe, Lori, you're going to be talking about in your webinar are going to help to sort of complete the picture here. That it really is, we really have to work together to create a much more comprehensive and integrated description of impacts and eventually, what sort of things, we can do to perhaps change some of the drivers that are contributing to, to this. So I'm looking forward to the next webinar.
Yeah. Ken, let me add to your
Yeah.
comment. Really good to hear from you. I'm a little worried about more is better in terms of sensors and smartphones. What I really am expecting is that smarter is better. We're trying to measure strain in the building, in the inter-story drift. Seismometers are not the way to go. The DOS sensors and even the GPS that you started with, back in the day, to get strain is what you really need to do to go directly to damage. And so I think there's going to be a challenge to go from just seismology to much smarter sensors and different, like Ron said, utilities. The pigs that are floating around in the pipelines and other things that we'll be communicating are going to be fundamental to integrate and quite challenging to do so.
Boy, that is really great to hear you say, Dave. And I like the figures you showed from Northridge were from your paper that included the GPS and leveling data. That was brilliant. And one thing I want to add to your comment there, Ron, if I could, I'm picturing a Venn diagram where you've got circles representing engineering, science, and you added social science, and I would add one more, and that's emergency management. And in the world that I'm in now at Edison, I'm in the business resiliency department. So the business case, the value proposition from a corporate standpoint is that if it's going to help with our business continuity, that's a win. And we're looking at those metrics that people are posting up in the big reports, Keith Porter and others, where we're looking at benefit cost analyses. That matters a ton because affordability is always in consideration when we're operating a big electric utility in our case. So you've got to keep that in mind, and the economic factor is very important. So where that comes in, really the value proposition that is successful is business resiliency. And so that is emergency management. That's how we do incident management and emergency response. So as we work together on figuring out how to bring in more data, but also smarter, analytical tools and real time, as you're saying, take advantage of ML and AI and those new advances as well. So I'm excited about the potential. And, the more we can do before the next big urban earthquake, the better too.
Thanks, Ken.
You Ken. That was a great conversation. I want to move to Ron here and hand this over to you with the potential of two Charlies. So you earlier made a statement, I wonder if Charlie is still online. I don't know if you meant Charlie Scawthorne or Charlie Hike, because Charlie Hike is still here and he has a question. And so to you, it says, Ron, how do you see IT infrastructure being added to the pantheon of lifeline risk? So I would ask Ron if you address the two things. It could be to one person or it could be to the two different Charlies, but please, I'll hand this to you to address those.
Okay, let me maybe it was a little confusing, right? Earlier, Jim Goltz, who I don't think is still on, had a question about, how or why the insured losses, were not adequately quantified. And I know, and that was kind of a question I was trying to throw to Charlie Scawthorne. And so I don't know if Charlie Scawthorne saw the question, but maybe that's something that, he could participate in. With regard to Charlie Hike's question about IT and lifelines and so forth, I think that one of the things someone's got to mute themselves. I think one of the challenging areas with respect to lifelines is understanding much more comprehensively the interconnections between lifelines. I think that, sometimes we tend to look at these systems in sort of siloed fashion. And I think that, in a lot of the discussions that are occurring right now, it's becoming very, very evident that, you don't have a resilient, say, water system unless you have, power. And vice versa. And I think there are a lot of things like this that are beginning to emerge where people are asking, for ways of better quantifying, these sorts of interactions, the extent and so forth. And I think that it means that, we need to get a better handle on systems. We need to get a better handle on how, for example, they're monitored in a disaster, how they can be used to sort of inform, say governments as well as other lifeline operators on, when things are down, when things, are going to be brought up. And, in fact, what's pretty scary is, I think it was the big IT disaster that we had, affecting the airlines. I mean, everything is so interconnected and it's a much more complicated, community. And I think that it just leads to other vulnerabilities that maybe we didn't really think about and so forth. So I think we need to pay much more attention to these interconnections and so forth. And maybe IT can not only help, but I think we need to understand, essentially their vulnerabilities as well.
All right. Thank you. Mark, can you allow Charlie to speak? Okay. I think he is available if he unmutes.
Go ahead, Charlie.
We hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay. Well, first of all, there was this question. Thank you. And let me second everybody else's comments about a very good presentation. I've already put that in the chat. This question about insurance, that I didn't see Goltz's question, but I addressed much of that in the third episode of this series. And I would refer you to that. But in a nutshell, there were a number of factors that led to the underestimate of the insurance losses by a much greater factor than the estimate of the total property losses. Not that the latter were perfect either, but the insurance initial losses were a gross underestimate. And everybody had it wrong. And there was some of the reasons were the initial seismological information had the epicenter further away than at least effectively it affected the ground motions. The ground motions were higher than we understood on the day of the earthquake. The what's called the insurance penetration was grossly underestimated. All of us were using, well, I wasn't, but most people were using statewide averages of the insurance penetration, which means the number of people who've taken earthquake insurance. We knew that the insurance penetration in LA County was higher than the statewide average. That's obvious, but we still underestimated it also. And there are other factors, and it's all in the presentation on the third episode. I would like to mention with regard to the lifelines, somebody asked about the impedance. Well, you've discussed the successes in 1994. What were the failures or impedances or things that could have been done better, whatever? And I think one of the ongoing problems is with infrastructure, in that to some extent, there are a number of communications and information barriers that impedes the understanding of the infrastructure performance at the time of the event. And this has partially to do with the utilities are privately owned, and has partially to do with the security issues. This is critical infrastructure, and some of these details cannot be made public. There are profit motives. Redundancy is reliability in engineering is seen as a good, but in economics is seen as a redundancy, which is a negative, and needs to be reduced. And these two attitudes towards reliability are a tension that needs to be resolved, and often falls in a gap. And lastly, we talked about evolving or emerging challenges. One challenge that I think is emerging is the widespread use of solar panels. I'm very much in favor of solar, but what we're seeing is actually the implementation of the vision of a distributed generation system where every house generates its own electricity, is tied into the grid, has a battery, and in a sense, we have now distributed generation, or we're heading in that direction, and that's great. But the seismic performance of solar panels and the batteries and the grid connections and so on remain to be seen. And actually, these may be a source of fire. They may be a source of widespread loss of generation when we remove our central generation stations, when we reduce our central generation stations, the fossil fuel, and rely on solar, and then we have an earthquake and all the panels, if they haven't burst into flames, fail. So these are some challenges that we just need to think about going forward. I'm not a doomsayer at all, but in any event, I just wanted to thank both of you and the other interlocutors for this discussion. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Charlie.
Hey, Craig, I need to drop off.
Yeah, Ron, go ahead and leave when you need to, but I'm gonna maybe be wrapping it up here. So I don't see any more questions on the chat for the Q&A, and I don't see any more hands raised. So this is your final opportunity before I formally close the informal session, which I think is also being recorded. It might be available. Mark can confirm that. But
It is.
okay, so 3, 2, 1. Are there any others? I don't see any. So let's go ahead and close it up. And I thank you all for staying longer. And I think all of those who joined, this was a great session and excellent participation.